Some students would break down in tears, others, feeling humiliated in front of the whole class, would beg for mercy, repeatedly apologizing and saying things like, "I won't dare to do it again, please don't hit me." But she never showed even the slightest bit of sympathy toward them, none at all, not even once. He beat a classmate so badly that the student's nose started bleeding. That was the only time I ever saw someone bleed in a classroom. One of them described our homeroom teacher as a pervert. She told me this as if it were a joke. She angrily confronted the girl, demanding what kind of girl would put up a photo like this, and publicly labeled her a dancer, a euphemism of a stripper. Please note that this was said by a woman in her 40s to a 13-year-old girl. Those who left their seats or talked to each other were unknowingly captured in his photos. When he learned in advance the routes that certain couples were likely to take when meeting, he would hide his phone in advance inside a flower pot among the roadside greenery. These photos, once taken, would also be shown to the students' parents. Recently, another Chinese postgraduate student has taken their own life. I don't know whether suicides caused by academic pressure are common in the West, but I myself have encountered several such cases, some of them at the school I once attended. A friend of mine once asked me whether this kind of news is allowed to be reported in China. You may share the same curiosity. The answer is that the government does not absolutely prohibit such reports, but it will certainly use its power to limit their impact. For example, when a story like this is reported today, related discussions on Chinese social media platforms will inevitably be restricted, and the comment sections under some video report may even be directly disabled. The government is wary of such coverage because some people will link student suicide to governmental negligence and use this to argue that the rule of the Communist Party lacks legitimacy. They believe that it is the Communist Party that has pushed these individuals to the point where they feel they have no choice but to end their lives. Naturally, the party does not allow such claims to spread. That said, I personally believe it is incorrect to attribute a person's suicide solely to external circumstances. The most important causes are psychological. In my view, that student, as a Chinese student, must have shared certain psychological traits common among many Chinese students. These traits are shaped by our education system, and Chinese education, especially from primary school through high school, is in many ways a process that generates psychological trauma. This process can leave students mentally fragile and vulnerable, planting the seeds of future psychological crises that may develop into various extreme behaviors, including suicide. In this video, I will briefly draw on my own personal experiences, and I hope this can help you understand the psychological state of Chinese students. First, there is an issue of teachers physically abusing students. This phenomenon may begin as early as the second or third year of primary school. In my memory, there was a math teacher and an English teacher who started teaching me around that time. Our entire class was deeply afraid of them because they were prone to sudden outbursts of anger during lessons. This may be a common trait among many Chinese teachers. They seem like completely different people on and off the job, perfectly normal after work, but once in class, they can become extremely irritable, even neurotic. Their anger demeanor was often accompanied by both verbal and physical aggression. At primary school age, children naturally like to chat. In Chinese classrooms, this is seen as a lack of discipline or even disrespect toward the teacher. As a result, it often provokes immediate anger from the teacher. A common scene was our English teacher forcefully throwing pieces of chalk or blackboard eraser at students who were talking as a way of expressing her rage. Instantly, the entire class would fall silent because everyone was frightened by her extreme reaction. It felt like prey suddenly noticing a predator watching from a distance, too afraid to make any move. And this was exactly the effect she wanted. The classroom would fall into brief silence and her authority would be firmly established. After a few seconds of silence, she would almost shout at the students she had hit, saying something along the lines of, "I had to stop the lesson because you failed to follow discipline, which prevented other students who wanted to learn from continuing. You've wasted their time. You should feel ashamed." In that kind of atmosphere, every student was terrified and almost no one dared to express a different opinion from the teacher. Situations like this happened countless times during my primary school years. Compared to this, there were even more serious cases. Teachers could not guarantee that every piece of chalk they throw would hit a student, so in a sense, throwing chalk was actually one of the least harmful forms of corporal punishment. More severe incidents involved my math teacher. Her preferred method of punishment was striking students' palms. I know some people might say this is not particularly extreme. This form of discipline exists in many parts of the world and is even formally regulated in some schools. But the problem with my math teacher was that she never clearly defined under what circumstances such punishment should be applied. As a result, during the first year or two, she would still give specific reasons and relatively restrain herself when using a ruler to hit students' palms. But after about the third year, it became almost entirely arbitrary. Whenever she was in a bad mood, she would lash out at students, not even limiting herself to hitting their hands. One of the most extreme instances I witnessed was when she would suddenly call out a list of students' names without warning and have them stand in a line. Then, one by one, they would walk up to her. She would point out mistakes in their homework and loudly interrogate them about why they got them wrong. How could you make such a simple mistake? You shouldn't be making such low-level errors. This was something she said frequently. In her view, careless mistakes were completely unacceptable. Whenever this happened, she would become exceptionally furious. Faced with her almost hysterical questioning, most students were too frightened to defend themselves. A small number who tried to explain would only provoke even greater anger, because this was seen as talking back, an act of disrespect toward her authority as a teacher. Then she would forcefully slap the students' exercise book into their face, sometimes repeatedly, depending on how angry she was. After dealing with one student, she would move on to the next in line. Some students would break down in tears, others feeling humiliated in front of the whole class would beg for mercy, repeatedly apologizing and saying things like, "I won't dare to do it again. Please don't hit me." But she never showed even the slightest bit of sympathy toward them. None at all, not even once. Likewise, this kind of situation did not happen just once, but the story is far from over. It wasn't until my 5th year of primary school that I encountered what felt like a true nightmare. He was my new homeroom teacher, a male Chinese teacher. His level of violence was on an entirely different scale compared to the previous teachers. First of all, he was physically much stronger than the others. On one occasion, he beat a classmate so badly that the student's nose started bleeding. That was the only time I ever saw someone bleed in a classroom. I can no longer remember the exact reason, but I still clearly remember the expression on that boy's face. He stood at the front of the classroom, not crying, pressing his arm against his nose. A few students stepped forward, trying to help him to the infirmary, but he told them, "I can work on my own, no need to help." The other students, seeing him bleed, began whispering among themselves, yet no one dared to openly stand up and say that the teacher was wrong. Meanwhile, the teacher showed a look of contempt and even asked the students, "Do you think you deserve sympathy?" implying that he had done nothing wrong and that the student deserves to be beaten. The teacher faced no punishment for this. On another occasion, I was beaten by him for talking to a classmate during his lesson. He kicked me hard in the leg, sending both me and my chair sliding about a meter away. That afternoon, I was made to stay in his office, where another teacher was working. I cried there for the entire afternoon. The other teacher asked me what had happened, but I said nothing. I just kept crying. Eventually, that teacher stopped paying attention to me and continued with their own work. After my homeroom teacher had finished all his classes, he called my mom to the office. They talked for a while, presumably about me. On my way home, my mother kept comforting me. She did not blame me at all, but neither did she think the teacher had done anything wrong. Perhaps that was because I forgot to tell her that he had kicked me. At the time, in my understanding, I had been punished because I had done something wrong, and that was something deeply shameful. I clearly remember my mother telling me that when she went to my classroom earlier that day, she had asked my classmates about what had happened. One of them described our homeroom teacher as a pervert. She told me this as if it were a joke. By the time I reached secondary school, the physical abuse of students by teachers had indeed become less common, but it had not disappeared. The most vivid incident of secondary school I remembered was being slapped across the face with an exercise book by my secondary school homeroom teacher. She was also a highly hysterical person, though fortunately her tendency toward violence was somewhat less severe than that of my primary school teachers. At the time, according to our class rules, every student was required to hand in their homework as soon as they arrived in the classroom in the morning. During that period, perhaps because too many students had failed to complete their assignments, my homeroom teacher came to the classroom early one day and watched as students handed in their homework one by one. As it turned out, before I arrived, not a single student she had checked had completed their homework, so she placed all her expectations on me since I was one of the better performing students in the class. She believed I should set an example for others. But when I arrived and she asked to see my exercise book, she opened it and found that I hadn't done the homework either. She instantly flew into a rage and slammed the book hard into my face, leaving my ears ringing. Later, she told me that I should have been on her side. If I failed to complete my homework, it would undermine her authority among the other students and be detrimental to the class's management. So you see, power struggles in a communist country begin as early as secondary school. Fortunately, most of the time, they didn't resort to physical violence. They resorted to humiliation instead. Be grateful, one might say. At least that's a bit more civilized. There were plenty of such examples. On one occasion, the homeroom teacher asked us to decorate the classroom with our own photos. A girl put up an artistic portrait of herself on the wall. It was a completely normal photo, but the teacher clearly didn't see it that way. She angrily confronted the girl, demanding what kind of girl would put up a photo like this, and publicly labeled her a dancer, a euphemism of a stripper. Please note that this was said by a woman in her 40s to a 13-year-old girl. In another instance, my Chinese teacher in secondary school became furious when she saw a boy and a girl playing a simple string game together. She dragged both of them to her office and reprimanded them. I happened to overhear the entire scolding. She said, "What are you trying to do? Are you that close? If you are so close, why don't I just arrange your marriage today? Should we inform your parents right now so they can meet each other?" She then repeatedly scolded them in a harsh tone, calling them shameless. I don't understand why two students simply playing a string game would lead her to think of marriage, nor do I understand what is supposedly shameful about marriage. Moreover, when I entered the university, I had the opportunity to do an internship at a secondary school in a provincial capital in China. I found that the situation of secondary school students had not changed. Teachers still maintained the same angry, hysterical demeanor in front of students and continued to insult and intimidate them. Their methods were largely the same. They would exaggerate the consequences of not studying seriously. For example, saying that if students did not study hard, they would not be able to find a decent job or even earn enough money to support themselves. I am not saying that teachers should never use exaggeration, but they should at least have a basic sense of empathy towards students. Clearly, many Chinese teachers do not. Under such reprimands, most students showed fear and some even cried in front of the teachers. Yet the teacher did not seem to realize that their words were hurting the students. Instead, they continued to repeat the same behavior, deepening the students' fear. I can almost guarantee that, in the subconscious of most Chinese people, school is closely associated with the concept of terror. Finally, let us move on to high school. Here, the teacher's method evolved once again, while becoming somewhat more civilized. Physical violence almost disappeared. I suppose this was because they realized that they could no longer match high school students physically. Verbal abuse also became less overt. Now, it was technology's turn to come into play. My high school homeroom teacher independently devised a method of managing students, secretly taking photos of them. He mainly did this at night. Chinese high school students are usually required to stay in the classroom to do homework and exam practice until around 9 p.m. before they are allowed to leave and go home. During this time, since most teachers has already finished work and are no longer at school, students have relatively fewer restrictions on their behavior compared to doing boring homework. Of course, they would prefer to chat and play with their classmates. However, my homeroom teacher's management philosophy was to ensure that students constantly restrain their own behavior especially at night, requiring them to remain at their seats and focus on studying at all times. The best way to achieve this would obviously be to keep students under constant surveillance. This is clearly impossible. But my teacher was very clever. He had likely read Michel Foucault and understood that to discipline individuals, it is not necessary to monitor them constantly. It is enough to make them feel as if they are always being watched. So what did he do? At night, after finishing work, he would occasionally return to the school without notice and secretly appear at the back door of the classroom. Through the window in the door, he would use his phone to secretly take photos of what was happening inside. Due to the lighting at night, it was very difficult for students inside to notice someone standing outside. Those students who were not following the rules, those who left their seats or talked to each other, were unknowingly captured in his photos. Later, during parent-teacher meetings, he would present these photos to the parents as evidence. In reality, this was a form of public humiliation. The parents of the students who were photographed would often feel pressured and help the teacher correct their children's behavior. As for students, knowing that the teacher might appear at any time to secretly take photos, they were constantly kept in a state of insecurity and were forced to restrain their behavior at all times. Later on, some students in our class began investigating the teacher's movements after work through various means and shared the information with the whole class. Sometimes, if the teacher's daughter was ill and he had to stay at home to take care of her overnight, we could be certain that he would not appear at school that evening. On nights like that, it became a party for the entire class. In the years after I graduated from high school, that teacher was quickly promoted. In China, teachers can be directly promoted into the Communist Party system, and he is very likely now a member of the party. His practice of secretly taking photos did not stop. Instead, he extended it to managing the entire school across all classes. The targets of his surveillance were no longer limited to students in the classroom, but also included student couples secretly dating around the campus, since romantic relationships among students are prohibited in China. Moreover, his method became increasingly refined. When he learned in advance the routes that certain couples were likely to take when meeting, he would hide his phone in advance inside a flower pot among the roadside greenery. These photos, once taken, would also be shown to the students' parents. With this, I have finished recounting my unusual experience from my student years. In general, Chinese children who endure 12 years of education emerge with their minds and possibly bodies severely damaged. There are even studies suggesting that the brain structures of people who have undergone Chinese-style education are different from those of normal brains. China is, in many respects, a materially developed country, wealthy and peaceful. Many Chinese children are born into families whose economic circumstances exceed what many people in the Middle East or Africa might achieve even after a lifetime of effort. Yet, the anxiety and fear they accumulate during their upbringing are not any less than those experienced by people living in war-torn regions. Additionally, student suicides are not uncommon in China. I still remember the girl who sat next to me in second grade of primary school. She was very smart, and the two of us often argued at that time. She later attended the same high school as I did. During the May Day holiday in year 11, she jumped into a river in Shanghai and took her own life. I heard that the reason was related to her family. I had not been in contact with her since we graduated from primary school, but I was still shocked by the news. I asked the classmates around me whether the school was going to hold any kind of memorial for her death. They were visibly shocked by my question and said, "Why should the school hold a memorial? How could that be? The final year of high school is right before the college entrance exams." What they meant was that the college entrance exams was the most important thing. If students were made to focus too much on such news, it would distract them and hinder their exam preparation. On the Monday following the week we learned of her death, the school carried on as usual with the national flag raising ceremony, a communist ritual where all students gather on the playground every Monday morning to listen to a student representative give a speech, usually praising the country and encouraging everyone to study hard. During that ceremony, I noticed a girl from her class crying. I assumed she was probably her friend. After that, I never saw anyone discussing her death again. The year after I graduated from high school, another student from the same school took their own life by jumping from a building on campus. Later, a friend told me that the deceased student's homeroom teacher had also been his teacher, and that this teacher was extremely strict, with many students holding grievances against him. I contacted a teacher I had known from that school to ask about the incident, but she refused to provide any information, saying, "Don't believe outside rumors, trust our teachers." Shortly after my internship at the secondary school mentioned earlier, another student there also died on the campus by suicide. I learned about this through a post on a social media made by a student I had met during my internship. Aside from that, there was no public report about it. That concludes the cases of underage student suicides I have personally encountered in China, and this video should come to an end here as well. I hope it has helped you gain a more comprehensive understanding of China. May the souls of those who have passed rest in peace.